Hello and welcome. I'm Nadira Tudor and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya headquarters. These are our top stories. The International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Secretary Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas leader Mohammed Deif. The Biden administration looks to cancel half of Ukraine's economic aid debt, which currently stands at $4.65 billion. And a fascination with Putin, as well as other authoritarian leaders. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel lets loose on her experience with Donald Trump as she prepares to release her memoirs. Now to a developing story, and the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli PM and the former defence minister, along with a senior Hamas leader. Benjamin Netanyahu's office has rejected the issuance of the warrant, describing the court as anti-Semitic, as efforts elsewhere intensify to try and bring an end to the war. The renewed diplomatic push by senior US envoy Amos Hochstein, who's now in Israel, comes as the Israeli military continues to pound targets in both Lebanon and the Palestinian enclave. Officials in Gaza say they're dealing with mass casualties on the ground. For more, let's get the latest from our Middle East correspondent, Sarah Coates, who is in Tel Aviv. Sarah, what more do we know?
Yes, hello there, Nadira. Well, this is certainly very significant. It is the first time that the International Criminal Court has issued such a warrant against the leader of a democratic country. Now, what it does mean is that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also the former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, that they will be facing arrest if they try and travel to any of these more than 120 countries that are actually party to the ICC. Now, we do have reaction coming in. One of the first to react was actually the opposition leader, Yair Lapid. He said that this is shameful. He said that Israel is defending itself against terrorist organisations that attacked, murdered and raped our citizens. He says these arrest warrants are a reward for terrorism. Now, we've also heard from members of Israel's government. They are slamming this decision by the International Criminal Court as anti-Semitic, saying it is a legal absurdity. Now, one of the voices that we've been hearing from is the far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He took to X. He said that the answer to these arrest warrants is applying sovereignty all over the territories of Judea and Samaria and settlement in all parts of the country, along with severing ties with the, quote, terrorist Palestinian Authority, along with sanctions. Now, it is very important also to point out the timing of this announcement by the ICC. It comes as this top US envoy is here in the region. He's actually holding talks today with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after having talks in Lebanon over the past couple of days with senior Hezbollah and also Lebanese officials. Now, Amos Hochstein came out to talk to journalists after he left Lebanon. He said that he is making progress, additional progress, and according to reports here in Israel in Hebrew media, most of the points of the deal have been agreed upon by both parties, while Hezbollah says that a deal depends on the Israelis. Now, in terms of all of this, as this happens, fighting is still going on between Israel and Hezbollah. Over the course of the last 24 hours, there have been fresh evacuation alerts issued for the southern Beirut suburb of Hyer. It is traditionally a Hezbollah stronghold, and there have been a number of strikes in that area, with authorities on the ground reporting quite a number of casualties. Now, additionally, there's also been a fresh evacuation order issued for the coastal city of Tyre. We do understand that just north of this city in Lebanon, there have been a number of strikes with civil teams on the ground working to actually extract people who have been wounded or killed in these bombings. So certainly a very significant day in terms of this announcement to indict the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and also the former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, along with Mohammed Deif. He's a senior Hamas Hamas leader, and it still remains unclear as to whether he is alive or dead. Hamas claims he is alive, but the Israeli authorities, the military, claim that they did kill him a matter of months ago.
Thank you, Sarah Coates in Tel Aviv. Let's delve a little deeper into this with former President of the International Criminal Court, Dr. Chile Eboe-Osuji. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much.
Now, this decision means that the judges agree that there are sufficient grounds to issue a warrant. What are the alleged crimes Netanyahu and Gallant are being accused of?
Oh, well, no, these are effectively war crimes. Starvation of a civilian population, crimes against humanity, engaging in indiscriminate warfare, all of which crimes in international law.
Now,
it is also possible down the line to revise the charges and add some more charges in the indictment.
It'd be interesting because obviously it's a very complicated process, and it would be interesting from your perspective and your experience for us to understand exactly what it means and what obligations now an arrest warrant has been issued for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defence Secretary Yoav Gallant by the International Criminal Court. Please do explain.
To begin with, one major takeaway from this is that international law insists that those who engage in armed conflict must observe certain basic norms, violations of which will result in inquiry into accountability, will result into prosecution. So war crimes. It tells us, it confirms what we've known since 1945, that there is no immunity for anyone on the basis of office, be it head of state or head of government. I mean, as we speak, I have a brand new book that was released only last month, titled The End of Immunity. You can see that. That's a new book, End of Immunity, holding world leaders accountable for aggression, genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The story of that norm, there is no immunity for anyone, started in 1919, when an effort was made to prosecute the most powerful man of the time, the Kaiser of Germany. It was a new idea in 1919. But by 1945, it was no longer a new idea. You had prosecution of the surviving leaders of the Third Reich, all of them. And you had in the Far East a prosecution of members of the Japanese Imperial War Cabinet, with the exception of the emperor at the time, who was spared for political reasons, not for legal reasons. So you now have a concretization of the idea that anyone who committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, the crime of aggression, would be held accountable in international law. So that is the story of the end of immunity, and we see that norm now playing out in real time before us.
Dr. Eboe-Osuji, I'd like to pick up on the no immunity question, because obviously the comments that we're getting from the likes of Netanyahu at the moment, and we've heard previously from President Vladimir Putin, is that they are ridiculing these arrest warrants. Why is that still allowed, therefore, if everyone is meant to opt in, as you say?
Well, everyone's meant to opt in, but unfortunately, not everyone does. But the fact that not everyone does not take away from the norm itself. You have now 124 states of the world who are now parties to the Rome Statute, member states of the ICC, they have a specific obligation to arrest anybody that the ICC has issued an arrest warrant against. It is a specific obligation. Sometimes some people, some states may not respect that obligation because they're not powerful enough to resist the pressure. But for most states, it is an obligation. For instance, UK is a state party to the Rome Statute. France is a state party to the Rome Statute. Germany, Spain, these are big, powerful countries in Europe. And they have now an obligation to arrest either Mr. Netanyahu, Mr. Gallant, or the Hamas chief if they find them. So this now means effectively that none of these people can travel with comfort, at least, to any state party to the Rome Statute. And people tend to underestimate the significance of that. You can, as you are, you and I, we are ordinary citizens. We can hop on the plane and go to Paris, to Spain, to Italy on holiday and not give a thought to it. But now you have a head of state who would have to think twice, or head of government who would have to agonize, should I make this trip or not? That is not small. People think it is, it isn't.
Yeah, and you're making it very clear that how serious this is, but it's the reality, isn't it? The international community need to understand what the reality now these arrest warrants have been issued. So it's a long process, we've established that. It may never result in imprisonment. That's the reality, isn't it? And how hard is it going to be to get Netanyahu and Gallant to attend even a court hearing, for example, never mind an actual physical arrest?
Well, that will take care of itself. I think at this stage, we don't want to confuse things. International law is set up as it is. International law, we've always known, it's nothing peculiar to the ICC, World Health Organization, the UN itself. International law does not enforce itself. You do not have one supreme authority all over the world. Thomas Hobbes called it a Leviathan. You don't have one Leviathan that enforces international law for everyone, nor should we have that kind of Leviathan. So international law's enforcement depends, it is decentralized, it depends on nation states to make it work. But whether or not the nation states do their part is not a problem for an institution that's doing its own part. It's not a problem of the ICC whether or not states execute the arrest warrant. ICC has discharged the obligation on itself. So it is any member of the international community with an obligation to execute the arrest warrant that doesn't do it. The fault is on that member of the international community, not on the ICC. So the question to ask would be on those bodies that or states that refuse to cooperate and do their part in international law. It is not the fault of the ICC. Oftentimes people tell, well, Mr. Bashir of Sudan, when he was president, was able to travel to Jordan and wasn't arrested. And did the ICC fail? No, ICC did not fail. ICC issued the arrest warrant for Mr. Putin, for Mr. Bashir, and now Mr. Netanyahu. It has done all that it is set up to do and can do. People need to recognize that. International law, to that extent, is working. If anybody decides to undermine it because they don't want to do their bit, that's their problem, not the ICC's.
Both members of the incoming Trump administration and the Israeli government have accused the court of bias and anti-Semitism. Do you think there will now be huge pressure on the court to reverse this decision or attempts to prevent its implementation?
The only way the decision gets reversed is if there's an appeal to the appeals chamber of the court and they agree to vacate it. but the political pressures is what that is, and what they are. Slur campaigns is normal. ICC judges and officials are used to that. Remember, this is not the first time the ICC has been called names. When the ICC was prosecuting the leaders of Kenya for the post-election violence of 2007-2008, the Kenyan authorities engaged in this intense campaign. I happened to be at the court at the time, calling the ICC racist, an instrument of neocolonialism, and all kinds of stuff, trying to tarnish the court's image. The same thing would happen here. We've already seen it happening, ICC being called anti-Semitic. ICC is not anti-Semitic. It is not racist. ICC has a statute that lays out what the law it applies is, and it's operating according to that. When the war in Gaza started, right very early on, before the heavy bombings even started, the ICC chief prosecutor went to Rafah and gave a press conference there, gave another press conference in Egypt, I believe, when he said that, look, people need to be very careful. There are international rules of law that guide the conduct of armed conflict. And there are war crimes that can get committed if those rules are violated. Everybody must pay close attention to those. ICC chief prosecutor said that early on. Apparently, people thought they could call the bluff, and here we are.
Dr. Chile Eboe-Osuji, former president of the International Criminal Court, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you very much for having me here.
The White House is planning to cancel $4.65 billion in debt owed by Ukraine, the latest in a series of efforts to provide support for the war-torn country before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. Congress could still block the move, but outgoing President Joe Biden wants to rush through as much assistance to Ukraine as possible before his term ends early next year, amid concerns that his successor could limit US aid. Benji Hyer reports.
On the battlefield, every metre counts. Having given the green light to the use of long-range American missiles to target Russian territory, the US is now supplying anti-personnel landmines to Ukraine to slow down Russia's advances.
The landmines that we would look to provide them would be landmines that are not persistent. You know, we can control when they would self-activate, self-detonate. And that makes it far more safer eventually than the things that they are creating on their own.
But is this help too little, too late?
Ukraine is on a losing trajectory, and this seems very much like a guilt trip on the part of the outgoing Democratic administration, who know they have not done enough, who have been overly cautious. And I think in the dying days of this administration, it looks as if they are just putting a little bit more into a field to get Ukraine into the best possible position before they see Trump as potentially wrecking it all.
President-elect Donald Trump, for his part, chose Matthew Whitaker on Wednesday as his nominee to be US ambassador to NATO, stating that the former acting attorney general will, quote, put America first. The former president has vowed to end the war in a single day without specifying how and whether that would mean pressuring Ukraine into a deal that sees it lose some of its sovereign land. It's why the Biden administration is hurriedly taking steps to secure extra backing to Ukraine in coming months, in part to give them a more favourable hand at the negotiating table. Meanwhile, the United States expects its embassy in Ukraine to return to normal operations today, having temporarily closed amid warnings of an air attack by Russia.
I can't get into obviously the specifics of the threat, but it's something that we always monitor closely. We take the safety and security of our personnel it's very important to us. We take it extremely seriously, and that's what led to the change in posture.
Сьогодні була нова російська ракета.
But with President Volodymyr Zelensky claiming that Russia has today, for the first time, fired an intercontinental ballistic missile at Ukraine, that threat has not gone away. Benji, Hyer, Al Arabiya News, Washington.
According to the Kyiv Air Force, Russia has launched an intercontinental ballistic missile attack from its southern Astrakhan region on Ukraine today. It's the first time Russia has used such a powerful weapon during the course of the war and follows Ukraine's strikes on Russia yesterday using US and British missiles. Sir Richard Shirreff is a former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO and joins me now. Sir Richard, we've heard from Kyiv's Air Force that an intercontinental ballistic missile was launched from Russia's Astrakhan region into Ukraine. Firstly, would you explain what kind of damage these missiles can do and what message you think the Russians are trying to send by using it, if true?
Well, in simple terms, it makes a very big bang and does a heck of a lot of damage. But by launching an ICBM, which is a missile by definition, which has to exit the atmosphere, go through space and then land, Russia is demonstrating its reach and its willingness to continue to escalate. And frankly, the so what from that is that Ukraine's partners have got to do even more to support Ukraine, because the only way this war is going to end is not with a so-called deal in a day. That won't achieve anything. The only way this war is going to end is with Ukraine defeating Russia in Ukraine. And to do that, NATO, the West, and Ukraine's global partners need to adopt a completely different strategy and a completely different mindset.
It's interesting that you say that they need to defeat Russia in Ukraine, and the fact that they've been given the permission to use those long-range missiles now in the heart of Russia. Since the US has given that permission for Ukraine to use their long-range missiles on Russian soil, they've been absolutely clear that they see this as a declaration of war with the US and with NATO. Is this a reasonable assumption from the Russian perspective?
We need to understand that from 2014, the Kremlin believes it has been at war with NATO. Now, clearly not conventional war, but asymmetric hybrid war, and that continues. No, the mindset in the Kremlin is that this is a war not just against Ukraine, it's a war against the West, and it's a war against Ukraine joining the West. And we in the West and in the wider global South and global commons need to understand that. It's a war against Ukraine and as a democratic, pluralistic, liberal state looking to build closer links with its Western allies.
Arguably, the US is one of the biggest countries in the West and supported by countries like the UK. It's understood that the permission was given so that Ukraine would have more of an even playing field in the conflict. And you've talked about Russia demonstrating what it can do, and it's obviously going to continue to do that. So without the US and NATO have direct military involvement, in your opinion, was this a reasonable move forward, or is it in fact a backward step?
What do you mean, the Russia's launching a missile, a backward step? Yes, if you're meaning that. If you mean by that America and UK granting permission to Ukraine to launch missiles it has been gifted by those countries to attack legitimate military targets in Russia, then absolutely not. But I would just point out in that respect, this is very, very constrained still. Thus far, my understanding is that those countries, America and the UK, have only given permission to Ukraine to use those missiles to support Ukrainian operations defending in the Kursk Oblast in Russia, not to use weapons against the Russians attacking Ukraine's eastern Donbass.
Now, we've heard that the Russian ambassador to the UK has suggested that the UK is now directly involved in the war in Ukraine. Do you think we are heading to a scenario where there could be a direct and open conflict between NATO and Russia? In other words, are we ever going to see boots on the ground?
Listen, we can't rule anything out, frankly. I mean, Russia has brought the politics of blood and iron back to Europe. It has committed the most appalling genocidal atrocities on Ukraine, a democratic, peaceful neighbor. It has leveled its cities, deported its population, massacred its civilians, raped its women, and it will continue to do so if it is allowed to do so. If Russia succeeds ultimately one day in removing Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state, which is the Russian intent, let's be clear about that. This is an imperialist venture by a paranoid state determined to rebuild another empire on the ashes of its democratic neighbors. If that happens, Russia will not stop at Ukraine. It will move on to Moldova, to Georgia, although it's continuing hybrid and asymmetric operations to get those in the bag, and very likely to move on to other ex-Soviet republics or republics annexed by the Soviet Union, such as the Baltic states. And if it did that, it would mean war between Russia and NATO. And the only way to prevent that is deterrence, effective deterrence by NATO. And that means NATO countries building up their armed forces, preparing for war, mobilizing defense industries, increasing defense expenditure, and building a deterrent structure and stance really from the Baltic to the Black Sea with Ukraine as a NATO member. And the precondition for that is defeat of Russia in Ukraine.
So Richard Shirreff, former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander Europe for NATO, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.
Thank you for having me.
Let's take a look at some of the other news stories making headlines today. Britain's former Deputy Prime Minister John Prescott has died at the age of 86 after a battle with Alzheimer's, serving alongside then Prime Minister Tony Blair from 1997 to 2007. Blair called him one of the most talented people he ever encountered in politics, who could talk in the bluntest and sometimes bluest language. 4 people have died and several others are in hospital in Laos after consuming drinks thought to contain methanol. 2 Danish women and a 56-year-old US citizen are reported to have died in what's being called a mass poisoning. And today authorities confirmed a 19-year-old Australian woman had become the 4th person to die. Social media could be banned for under 16s in Australia as the country's government introduces a proposed fine of up to $32 million for platforms who break the rules. An age verification system, biometrics or government identification could be put in place, making it one of the toughest controls by any country so far. An Icelandic volcano located near the country's capital, Reykjavik, erupted late last night for the 10th time in just 3 years. Meteorologists said it's starting spewing hot ash and lava, but thankfully hasn't disrupted air traffic or infrastructure or the city's 400,000 residents. And Pamela Hayden, the voiceover actress responsible for Simpsons characters Milhouse Van Houten and Jimbo Jones, will leave the established show after 35 years. The Simpsons has been on screen since 1989. Hayden will sign off from the long-running cartoon on the 24th of November. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel has revealed she sought advice from the Pope when Donald Trump was first elected President of the United States. Merkel's memoir, Freedom, set for release next week, details her difficulties with Trump, whom she says was fascinated by Russian President Vladimir Putin as well as other authoritarian leaders. For more on this, I'm joined from Berlin by our correspondent Trent Murray. Angela Merkel is arguably one of the most successful female politicians that we've seen in modern times, who famously sought advice from the Pope on how to handle Donald Trump when he wanted to quit the Paris Climate Accords. What did she have to say about that in her memoirs, Trent?
Yeah, an extraordinary admission from the former Chancellor that she sought a political advice from the leader of the world's 1.4 billion Catholics on how to deal with Donald Trump. But here we are. That's what she is saying in her new memoir. She said she spoke to the Pope asking how to deal with people that have different views to you and are strongly prosecuting those arguments. She said she didn't mention names, but the Pope immediately knew who she was talking to, and his advice back to her when it came to dealing with Donald Trump was to bend, his words, but make sure not to break the relationship. So in other words, some advice there to try and convince the combative former, now President-elect, back in office, of course, on that issue of the Paris Climate Accords. But much of the excerpts that we are reading today are about that difficult relationship that she had. She describes President Trump as being highly emotional, whereas she always tried to remain factual in her conversations with him. She said she often picked up that he was not paying attention to her arguments and instead was trying to construct new arguments to respond to with her and those disagreements. So look, this is only an excerpt of what is a larger memoir that we are expecting to be released next week, but it certainly does take us through that fraught relationship between President-elect Trump and former Chancellor Angela Merkel. As you said, when he took office, she was one of the world's longest-serving democratically elected leaders and certainly the most influential politician in Europe.
Trent, how honest has she been in her memoirs? Because obviously she's seen everything, hasn't she, really, behind the scenes? And what are the stories that stand out?
Look, I think what many of us were looking for was how she's responded to some of that criticism that she has attracted since she left office. She did leave office very popular, but the invasion of Ukraine really did blemish her record in many ways, with critics here and also in Central and Eastern Europe saying that she tried to appease too much to President Putin, and she also bet too big Germany's future with energy deals with Russia, which really put them in a precarious position once that invasion took place. She does make no apologies for that, though. She said that on the question of Ukraine being in NATO, that it was a dangerous game to play with Russia. She spoke about her relationship with President Putin, who she described as a man desperate to be taken seriously. And she also said some of those critics in other parts of Europe somehow want to try and wish Russia away, for it not to exist. But she said the fact is it is a heavily armed nuclear state and it absolutely does exist. So look, really making no apologies to some of that criticism. I expect we will read more about that in the book when it is released in full next week. But yes, certainly an interesting time. She's seen a lot, both in her personal life. Of course, she grew up in the communist East Germany under authoritarianism. She saw the wall come down and then was able to carve herself a very successful career as a politician in what still was then a very dominated parliament from politicians and personalities from the West.
Trent, I'm sure it'll be absolutely fascinating to read. Trent Murray in Berlin, thank you. Let's take a look at some of the top business news. Prosecutors could force Google to sell its Chrome browser in order to restore competition in the online search market. A trial on the proposal would take place in April. However, there's speculation that incoming President Donald Trump and the next antitrust division of the US Justice Department may step in beforehand. Flour makers across Asia, Indonesia and the Middle East have been left with a dwindling supply of stock as wheat prices hit a 4-year low. Bumper harvests are being blamed for the tumble, with farmers and traders holding out for better prices in top exporting countries. It's thought Asia's supply is covered for 2 months, whilst the Gulf has 45 days. Italian construction group WeBuild has confirmed their building project NEOM in Saudi Arabia is carrying on in line with the plan after the mega project's chief executive left the role last week. WeBuild told Reuters that it has no evidence of changes in the activity plan initially set for the project it's implementing, nor has it recorded any delay in payments. WeBuild is building a system of 3 dams to feed an artificial lake and a high-speed railway that would serve 9 million people in NEOM as part of Saudi Vision 2030. To sport now, and double Olympic triathlon star Alistair Brownlee is retiring at the age of 36. The world champion won gold in the 2012 and 2016 Games. Brownlee told fans on X he achieved more than he dared to imagine, but was now looking forward to embracing a slower pace of life. And women's cricket has become fully aligned with the men's game today as the T20 Blast fixtures for next year were confirmed. The new look 2025 season, which kicks off on Thursday the 29th of May, will include 52 double bills of men's and women's matches back-to-back in a historic first. Let's give you a reminder of our top stories. The International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defence Secretary Yoav Gallant, as well as Hamas leader Mohammed Daif. The Biden administration looks to cancel half of Ukraine's economic aid debt, which currently stands at $4.65 billion. Meanwhile, Putin confirms Russia did hit Ukraine earlier today with new intermediate-range missiles in response to yesterday's attack. And a fascination with Putin as well as other authoritarian leaders. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel lets loose on her experience with Donald Trump as she prepares to release her memoirs. That's all from us on W News. Thanks for joining us. Tom Burges Watson is coming up with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan in Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation that is still coming to terms with the outcome of the U.S. elections. In this episode, we'll consider the implications for this divided country, for the Democratic Party, and for conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. First up, Al Arabiya's chief correspondent, Simon Marks, has seen it all during decades of covering the political beat in Washington. But he's never seen anything quite like this. So Simon, 8 elections you've now covered. How did this one compare with the previous one?
Well, you know, Riz, I think that it is always said every 4 years that the United States is about to engage in the most important election of everybody's lifetime. And Americans are always told, you know, the future of the country depends on the outcome of this election. This time round, it had the added benefit of being true. Right? There is no question that this was the most important election any of us is ever going to cover because of the stakes. And the stakes are absolutely clear. We know that the Trump 2.0 administration is going to be much more radical. I mean, this is what they describe their plans to be than its predecessor, that he's learnt from what he thinks were the mistakes of the past, which was the coming to terms with people that didn't necessarily agree with him but brought expertise to the administration. So I think that it was always apparent that this was going to be an absolutely vital campaign and a campaign that was elemental in terms of discussing the future of American democracy. And then the twists and turns, the departure of Joe Biden from the race, the drama of that, the injection of Kamala Harris being given 107 days to try and persuade Americans to get behind her. First of all, she had to introduce herself to them. Then she had to explain her policies to them. She was better at the first part than the second part. And it all culminated with the repudiation of Democrats, both in the battle for that building, but also in the battle for Congress, for the United States Senate.
So that's what I was wondering, with those twists and turns you just described, how difficult did it make your job? Because, of course, you're always expected to be on top of things, but, you know, you wake up and things have changed that morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no campaign where everything goes according to plan for the two candidates, and indeed the whole concept of the October surprise, which is never that much of a surprise in recent years, exists to underscore the fact that this is always going to be a deeply, deeply unpredictable campaign. But a campaign in which you see the President of the United States succumb to a cabal by members of his own political party, orchestrated by one of his best friends, Nancy Pelosi, with whom Joe Biden has not spoken since he was defenestrated. The notion that we were going to watch his rival, Donald Trump, first of all defeat him in a television debate, then survive an attempted assassination that produced some of the most iconic images any American election has ever generated. You know, him getting back on his feet, the hand in the air, fight, fight, fight. The two conventions, always great images, you know, iconic images that come out of that. The Republicans leaving their convention in Milwaukee, absolutely convinced that they had this election in the bag because they were still at the time taking on Biden, then getting knocked on the back foot by Biden being replaced by Kamala Harris, then the attempted assassination, the attempted assassination, of course, happened before the Republican convention. All of these things brought together and underscored, I think, a really brittle sense in this country that the tension, the anxiety, just the sheer length of the campaign, the amount of money that was spent on it, the fundraising itself. I mean, all of us, journalists, my wife, who's not a journalist any longer, receiving endless fundraising messages on email, on telephones. Every 10 minutes her phone was buzzing with another request for funds. It's all added to this notion of tension and unease here.
And it's all about the aftermath. One of the big worries was the country was so divided that whatever the outcome, there would be potentially violence on the streets, there would be a lot of division. What sense do you have, it's only been a few days, but what sense do you have of the aftermath?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a building down there that is a commercial building that just a couple of days ago was ringed with fencing because the owners of the building were worried that, like the White House and the Vice President's residence, it could get ransacked and looted in the event of violence. That has all suddenly dissipated because really of the size of the victory. I mean, I think that this town particularly is despondent. It's a Democratic Party stronghold. There are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people here who realize they're not going to be able to stay here, partly because Donald Trump wants to replace them with ideologues, and partly because, you know, in every time there's a transition, the Republicans are coming to town, the Democrats in large measure are leaving. But I think the shock to the system of the size of the victory, the one outcome of this election that no one thought was likely was a Trump landslide. Democrats said they thought a Kamala Harris landslide might happen. Most people thought narrow win for Kamala Harris, narrow win for Donald Trump, days, weeks of tension, possible unrest, possible protest. Nobody thought it's going to be a Donald Trump landslide and it will be resolved within hours of polls closing. And that's where we are, and the Democrats have said they're going to engage in a peaceful transition. And I think that mostly in this town there will be despondency, especially when we get to January, and we're going to see some very uncomfortable imagery relating to Democrats leaving the White House, the Republicans arriving. I mean, it'll be not entirely dissimilar, I suspect, to when Donald Trump came visiting the White House after his first election win, and there's this iconic picture of Obama staffers gathered on the lawn watching Trump arrive, and they all look like absolute death warmed up. And I think we're going to see similar imagery this time around.
Have you had a chance to talk to any of Donald Trump's detractors? People
Yes.
like John Bolton, who, you know, was terrified of, to some degree, terrified of a Trump
Yes.
victory because he said, you know, now this time, as you alluded to in the first part of this, that he really has a better idea of what he can do. And how have those detractors, I mean, some of them have to run for the hills according to the threats.
Well, some of them have already left town. I mean, I know of two detractors, both of whom are not in Washington, D.C. One had already decided to leave the city some years ago and just get out of Dodge altogether, and the other one of whom deliberately positioned themselves overseas during election week because they were worried about what might happen. And in the aftermath of election week is suggesting that they are going to decouple themselves from the United States and establish themselves overseas instead. I think there is going to be an awful lot of that. And I think it will be because some people physically fear their own safety. And I think it is also because lots of other people will realize that their ability to build their careers here and, you know, pay their bills and look after their families is going to be heavily constrained as a result of the outcome of this election. So they're, in many cases, looking overseas. I was talking to a friend in London earlier today who was telling me that he works for a firm that has a department that deals with expats that is apparently overrun in the last 48 hours with requests from Americans for more information about how they can move and rebase themselves in the UK. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement.
What about those who suddenly seem to side with Donald Trump, RFK Jr.,
Absolutely.
Elon Musk? I mean, those were kind of surprise twists.
Opportunity knocks, doesn't it? I mean, Jeff Bezos, you know, who stopped the Washington Post here from publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris and sent Donald Trump congratulations messages over Elon Musk's social media platform yesterday. I mean, opportunity knocks, absolutely. Elon Musk definitely going to play some role in government. I think not in a cabinet position, because to do that he'd have to divest himself from his business interests, which seems extremely unlikely. But he's clearly going to be a Trump whisperer. RFK Jr., I mean, there is talk about becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services. I mean, some in Trump world have denied that's the plan, but RFK Jr. keeps fueling the notion. You're going to see ideologues and some of these external figures, these characters that have attached themselves to Donald Trump like a barnacle, playing a role in the administration. I think it's absolutely vital to underscore that Trump 2.0 is not going to look anything like Trump 1.0. First Trump Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, lovely man, foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice because she said, you need a man who understands the world. Rex Tillerson, this guy from Exxon, he'll sort you out. There's going to be none of that. General Jim Mattis, James Comey at the FBI, they're not going to work with any of these people. And that's going to change the character of this city.
Having seen how tight the polls were literally up to the end, the landslide victory was, of course, that much more of a surprise. To what degree do you think it might say something about America not being ready for a woman president, as they keep saying, possibly even not one of colour?
There's no question that that was a factor. I think there are multiple factors in the Democrats' demise in this election, but misogyny and racism was clearly a substantial issue. Barack Obama himself identified particularly the racist aspect of it when he went on the campaign trail and said that black men particularly he was hearing and believing were saying that they were not ready for a black woman in power. I think the misogyny issue is strong. I'm not sure it's as strong as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost her race, but it's definitely still a factor. But the Democrats' drubbing was so comprehensive that it's about more than that. In 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. 4 years later, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. That's 15 million people who have decided they don't want to vote Democratic this time round. Some of them may have racist reasons for doing that. Some of them may have misogynistic reasons for doing that. Bernie Sanders says a lot of them are members of the working class who feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, so they're going to abandon the Democratic Party. We know that many of them are Latino voters who are American citizens from Latino families who are hostile to the new wave of illegal immigrants coming into the country because they argue they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, did everything the way you were supposed to do it legally, and they support the deportation of some of these illegal immigrants. So I think that the question for the Democratic Party now is elemental. I mean, clearly so many things went so wrong, even including how long it took to put the arm on Biden to get him to abandon his re-election quest, that there's no one thing you can fix or blame. You can't say it's just misogyny or it's just racism. It is a whole packet of problems that the Democratic Party didn't see coming.
You know, Simon, there was a lot of talk about uniting the country after the election. I certainly know, I come here frequently and I sense the tensions and the divisions. Do you see any, as someone who's covered so much of this going on, do you see any signs there might be a move towards unity?
I mean, they always talk of a move towards unity after every election. And by the time the cadences of the sentence have finished echoing around the room that you're in, those calls have gone nowhere and are going to go nowhere. This is a tribal, 50-50 polarized nation. And there is nothing that the outcome of this election or Donald Trump's arrival in the White House said yesterday he's going to heal the nation, said that before, then he came and made the inaugural speech about carnage in America. There's no fixing it. These are two tribal groups of followers of the Democratic Party and the new Trump-dominated Republican Party, with disaffected Republicans in the middle, not quite sure where they're going to end up. And finding common cause between any of these people is going to be difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult because it's geographical, right? I mean, there are places where Republicans feel comfortable and at home, and there are places where Liberal Democrats feel comfortable and at home, and the twain don't often mingle and meet. And I think there's a fundamental problem to the concept of a homogeneous society in one nation here, because it increasingly doesn't exist.
Well, of course, all the factions came out during the campaign. You saw the Arab Americans, Black Americans, and so on. The Arab American story was an interesting one. How many people actually decided to support Trump from the Arab American community? Some people believe it's because of the backlash due to the lack of action taken by the Biden administration with the Israel-Gaza conflict, and some just, I guess, feel that Donald Trump is going to be someone who represents them better. He's promised to, stop all wars in a day, basically. But they're going to have to face the consequences of what he does or doesn't do now.
Yes, and remember that he's talked about possibly reimposing his Muslim travel ban, which is going to have an enormous community impact on the Arab American community. But I mean, the Arab American community in this election played a fascinating role, because they essentially said to the Democratic Party, enough. For 3 election cycles now, Barack Obama has gone to all Democrats and said, you may be disappointed in what we've done. Perhaps we haven't delivered on the things that you wanted, but you've got to vote for us because we're better than this guy, right? The Arab American community and other Democrats, furious over Gaza, in this election said, no, we're not going there. We're not doing it again. Bill Clinton traveled to Michigan days before the election and said to the Arab American community, Kamala Harris has said she's going to do what she can do to end the war, and she's going to try and advance the prospects of peace through diplomacy. That ought to be enough. That was the phrase he used to Arab American voters. Get over it. It ought to be enough. And it wasn't enough. And they had Jill Stein in Michigan, third-party candidate, appealing for their support. You can deny Kamala Harris the White House by voting for me if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. And it proved to be effective. And I think that message to Democrats is a broader message than one that's just coming from the Arab American community. You can't keep saying, vote for us, because you may not like us very much, and we may have disappointed you, but we're still better than the alternative. They have to go back into the kitchen and cook up a better proposition than that for 2028.
Having followed all the promises, and of course they are just campaign promises, what are you expecting to occur in this coming year, for example, or say post-January in 2025, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine and to Israel-Gaza?
Well, let's do Russia-Ukraine first. He's going to force Volodymyr Zelensky to make peace with Vladimir Putin and to give up parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, I think everybody understands that. The Europeans understand that. President Zelensky understands that. Vladimir Putin certainly understands that. He wants it done and dusted. And this is not just Trump, but the key figures that surround him in the foreign policy field say, we need to get this sorted out because we don't want to be obsessively involved in European security. We want to focus our attention on China. Europe's got to look after its own affairs. And the first plank of that is we sort out Ukraine. And the only way you sort out Ukraine is by pulling American military support and forcing Zelensky to make peace. So I think that's relatively clear. On Gaza, Trump and Netanyahu have been talking all the time. They've been speaking in recent days. Before the election, they were talking, with reports that Donald Trump said to Benjamin Netanyahu, get the military action in Gaza wrapped up by the time I take over in the Oval Office, because then it's got to be all about the day after resolving Gaza in whatever way you can, getting the hostages out become a big problem for any occupant of that White House if there are still American citizens being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But for the Trump administration, it's all about the Abraham Accords. It's all about expanding them, trying to bring about the normalization in ties between Israel and Saudi that many here in Washington believe the Hamas attacks of October the 7th was designed to derail. And so they want to get that Saudi track moving. And the way they think they do that is by ending the violence in Gaza, moving to the day after, which is obviously the really complicated bit, while simultaneously using the communication channels that they opened up through the Abraham Accords to try and get back to a place where you can think about the normalization of ties between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. That's what he's going to go for. It will obviously be incredibly complicated and difficult to get there.
Simon, to wrap up, with 8 elections now under your belts, do you ever see a third party emerging in the US? It seems like the idea of a third voice just completely disappeared this time.
I thought you were going to ask me if I've got a 9th one in me.
Yeah, well, there is that as well.
To which the answer is I'm not sure. A third party is so difficult here because the Republicans and the Democrats, we talk about them being the two big political parties. They're not just political parties. They are money machines. And one of the most amazing things about this election has been the fundraising. This has been a $10.5 billion election. Kamala Harris raised a war chest of $1 billion and was still asking for money from Americans even as the election got underway. So for a third party truly to catch fire, it's got to have big money behind it and national organizational heft. And that's why the genius, in a way, of Donald Trump was not to launch a third party. It was to take over the Republican Party and completely retool it from the inside. And that ultimately may be what some Democrats out there want to do with the Democratic Party. But to do that, you've got to say goodbye to Nancy Pelosi. She's a major cash provider through her fundraising capacities to the Democratic National Committee. The Obamas, obviously amazing fundraisers. You're going to have to take the reins of the party and then retool it, much as Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party, because launching a third party here is just so incredibly difficult. The climb is too steep.
It's frightening, isn't it? It's all about the money now.
It's absolutely all about the money, 100%.
Simon Marks, let's hope you get a 9th election in you, because I'd love to come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Riz.
Cheers. Well, my next guest is the Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Badar. I wanted to get his perspective on the role of Arab-American voters during the elections, as well as the likely impact of a second Donald Trump presidency on the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Omar, it's been a few months since we last had a chance to chat, and a lot has changed. What are your expectations in terms of U.S. foreign policy under a second Trump presidency?
You know, it's extremely unpredictable. If it's going to be anything like the first Trump presidency, we are looking at a situation of complete and total chaos in the region. Trump, the first time he came along, promised that American policy is going to be even more pro-Israel than it already was. And that meant recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, endorsing Israeli settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories, endorsing Israel's takeover of the Golan Heights in Syria, moving the embassy, and the list goes on of just letting Israel do whatever it wants and basically giving diplomatic cover to whatever Israel wanted to do. And at this point, we're right now witnessing a scale of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon that is really unprecedented. And Trump's promise that he's going to be even more pro-Israel right now is frankly terrifying, because it's difficult to imagine how much more pro-Israel it can get compared to the Biden administration that has given Israel a carte blanche to do whatever it wants to as well.
And yet, as one of his campaign promises, I will end all wars, and he says he can end it in a day. That contradicts that.
Yeah, it is a complete and obvious contradiction, and it's obvious that Trump does not really care much. All of it is campaign rhetoric, and he's frankly himself unpredictable as well. So it's not really clear in which direction he's going to move once he actually comes into office. But there is an obvious contradiction between this idea that he's going to let Israel, quote unquote, finish the job, and also being the anti-war candidate. Those things don't go together. Israel's project is one of endless war, trying to wipe out Gaza, trying to completely ethnically cleanse the northern part of it, and now stuck in Lebanon, also in a quagmire that does not have any positive horizon on the future where you can actually end that conflict. because we're entrenched in a situation in which Israel is demanding complete and total submission from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that is simply not going to be in the cards in the coming months.
There is that grey area of a few weeks between the actual election result and the inauguration. And it's still the Biden presidency until then. What chance is there, considering these possible contradictions, these possible twists, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could use this as an opportunity to scale things up until the Trump presidency is intact?
Yeah, I think we are already watching that actually unfold, where Netanyahu has escalated the violence in North Gaza in a very, very significant way, taking advantage of the fact that there's simply not going to be any major American policy interventions right now. Biden is towards the end of his presidency, and there is an anticipation of what Trump might do. And even with the uncertainty of what Trump brings with him, this is certainly the moment for Israel to try to do as much damage as possible, to try to capture as much land as possible, and to basically carry out in a fashion where the international community and the United States, particularly as the patron state that needs to sign off on whatever Israel does, is simply not going to be present in any meaningful way. So you can effectively say that Netanyahu is in charge of American foreign policy for this period, as far as the region is concerned, and is free to do whatever he wants.
Isn't there also, though, an argument that this is a window for Joe Biden to perhaps get a last-minute boost to his legacy by saying, well, you know, he's got nothing to lose by actually pushing very aggressively?
This assumes that Biden has the cognitive ability to actually do what's good for him. If he had that, he would have done policy very, very differently on Palestine and Israel for a very long time. Certainly, this would be an opportunity, but I have absolutely no confidence that Joe Biden is in any shape right now to try to think about what that legacy looks like and the desperate moral imperative of putting a stop to this onslaught in Gaza and being on record as the person who actually put an end to it. He doesn't seem to be interested in that. And frankly, I don't think he has the mental faculty to really intervene at this point in a way that would save his legacy, in addition to the endless lives of Palestinians.
Even if he did, I presume that it's really up to Benjamin Netanyahu to concur.
Yeah,
which doesn't seem to be the case.
It's you know, we've had all this talk constantly about Biden being upset with Netanyahu, being frustrated with Netanyahu, refusing to meet with him. But at the end of the day, as long as American military funding and diplomatic protection continues unabated, then Netanyahu has no reason to take any of these concerns seriously. They're simply just rhetoric. And right now, for Biden to actually step up to a level where he's willing to threaten U.S. military funding for Israel based on Israel's behavior just seems really implausible. But frankly, it might be the only thing that would change Israel's behavior in the meantime, apart from suffering a devastating defeat in a regional conflict that looks like it's about to spiral completely out of control as well.
I'll get onto that in a moment, but since we spoke in mid-March, things really have gotten even worse in Gaza. Could you have predicted it to reach this kind of level? And where does this leave the idea of any real ceasefire?
I don't think anybody could have seen how bad things were going to get into Gaza. I think the entire world operated on the idea that we would not witness a full-scale genocide with the world being silent and not intervening to stop it. And yet this is precisely what we have witnessed, is that we've had over a year of this, entire families being wiped out and children being starved to death. We are watching this on our TVs day in and day out. And yet the United States is ensuring that there is no intervention that would put an end to this. And yeah, it is insane that we have allowed things to reach this level. And at this point, I think there is simply no end in sight. We're finally at the point where I'm realizing, at least, that there is no red line for Israel, period, that they can actually go as far as they want to. And it's really going to be a matter of how things devolve in the region, rather than the U.S. playing the role that they have always intended to play. They've always talked about playing. The U.S. as a leader of democracy and human rights and values and freedom and all of that, it's just has been utterly dismantled by U.S. embrace of the extremist and fanatical policies of the Israeli government at this point, that I don't see a prospect for a change.
And you know, it's become even worse with Lebanon now being roped into it, and you couldn't have really predicted that at the time, or could you?
I mean, look, Lebanon, it felt inevitable. Frankly, I was one of the few people who was tweeting long before things escalated that this was inevitable. You have a setup where the only way out of that confrontation spiraling out of control would have been a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the only way that you would have put an end to it. And once it became clear that the U.S. has no interest in stepping in to achieve that ceasefire, to rein Israel in and put an end to this onslaught, then what was happening in Lebanon was absolutely inevitable. Because Hezbollah was determined that they were not going to stop what they were doing until the war on Gaza ends and until the onslaught and the genocide there comes to an end. And from Israel's perspective, they have a deterrence capacity that they're super invested in preserving. For them, the entire way that Israel can function in the region is through a relationship of regional dominance and dominance by force. So Hezbollah constantly engaging in these cross-border skirmishes was it was inevitable that Israel was going to overreact at some point and go all in. And right now, of course, they are stuck in a situation where they can't win. They can cause immense damage to Lebanon from the air. But in order to defeat Hezbollah, you would need to send ground troops basically into Lebanon. And that fight is not going well for Israel at all. Hezbollah is able to inflict significant damage on Israel on the ground. And we are stuck in Israel is stuck in a quagmire where, sure, Lebanon is suffering the heavier end of the devastation given Israel's aerial power. But this is also not a situation that Israel can extract itself from with any kind of victory. I think they're going to be stuck in there also for a long time, unless there is a bigger intervention from the world to put an end to this.
Well, there's often that discussion of a 3H axis, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there's also the belief, I guess, and I'd like your opinion on this, that Israel can only stretch itself so far.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. They already have their hands completely full with Hezbollah. I think they thought that by decapitating the leadership and the pager attack, they've done a few things at the very beginning that were absolutely devastating to Hezbollah, but I think they underestimated the resilience of that movement, that it's bigger than a handful of leaders. Even if you decapitate the leadership, the ideological commitment of a very significant portion of Lebanon that built this drive towards fighting for Israel as a result of Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the past. They remember what that is like, and that is a very heavily motivated population that is not going to put up with a reoccupation of Lebanon or with any kind of Israeli dominance and Israel dictating to Lebanon how it's going to behave. They're going to face very, very significant resistance going into that. So the Houthis, I think, are much farther away and much weaker in a sense. They're causing trouble primarily for them in terms of access to their, southern harbor. But that, in terms of a direct military confrontation, Hezbollah is where it's at. And potentially this bigger escalation with a direct confrontation with Iran, I think, would be absolutely devastating for the region. It has really untold consequences. And that, I think, is the really worrying sign, is there doesn't seem to be enough intervention to make sure that does not escalate out of control, because the tit for tat is ongoing and we're all anticipating what the Iranian response is going to be in the coming days.
I want to touch briefly on the ruling of the International Court of Justice that basically Israel is heading towards. It was the way it's phrased is kind of delicate, but the word genocide came up, which caused a lot of upset for pro-Israel supporters, obviously. What were your thoughts when South Africa took that step? A very bold step.
It was an extremely bold step on the part of South Africa, and an impressive one given the fact that South Africa has nothing to gain from doing this. It's obvious that the international order is ruled by the United States for the most part, and people who are looking for their own interests would stop short of crossing certain lines. When you go after Israel with a genocide charge at the International Court of Justice, obviously that's the kind of thing that's going to shake up a significant portion of the world against you. But it was absolutely a moral imperative, and I think given their history and knowing about Israeli support for apartheid during the apartheid era in South Africa may have been part of the motivating factor. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and many others talked about this common struggle between South Africans and Palestinians and enduring very similar conditions. And I think that was part of why they acted with that kind of boldness. And it's a charge that frankly sticks for a simple reason. You have people like Aryeh Hyer, who himself a Holocaust survivor, his family fled the Holocaust, started Human Rights Watch, headed the ACLU, very mainstream Jewish figure who fought for civil rights in general and for Jewish rights in particular. And he's come to the conclusion that what Israel is committing in Gaza is also a genocide. The credibility of that charge is really obvious for anybody who's not afraid to cross that line. It seems that everybody's squeamish about touching it for political reasons. But when you look at the scale of devastation in Gaza, when you look at the amount of destruction, the number of families that have been completely wiped out, and Gaza's inability to sustain life, at this point, I think this is really the only word that you can use to describe what is unfolding.
On that point, UNRWA, the UN Works and Relief Agency, is also facing the issue of now being blocked. Considering it's shifted so heavily into this humanitarian crisis, what impact do you expect from that?
Yeah, it's been absolutely devastating. I think with and without UNRWA in the short term, Israel is making it very clear that they are going to prevent Gaza from being able to sustain life in any way. They've been blocking food aid left and right, really putting the entire population of Gaza under conditions that are just unlivable. And I think that UNRWA is more about the long-term strategy of trying to end the existence of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is the reason why Palestinian refugees can survive, can actually live day by day, awaiting the right to return to their homes and to be able to go back to the homes that they have actually come from. And Israel is interested in dismantling they're interested in dismantling the entire Palestinian national movement for freedom And part of that is going to be chipping down at UNRWA and the ability of Palestinian refugees to survive as well.
As we kind of wrap up, a couple of quick thoughts. Where did it go wrong as far as Arab American voters in the US election?
Arab American voters understand what a threat Trump poses, but they could not bring themselves to vote for a Democratic administration that has enabled genocide for an entire year and would not even say anything about being serious about putting an end to it. And that has really shifted things in a way that is, and what's also equally impressive about it is how savvy Trump was, that he went to Michigan selling himself as the pro-peace candidate, poking fun at the Democrats, at his opponent for campaigning with Liz Cheney and talking about how the Cheneys want to destroy the Middle East and invade every Arab and Muslim country and so on. It was a level of political savviness on the Trump administration. It is frankly shocking and shameful that the Democrats did not see what an opportunity they were wasting in taking a politically smart choice that is also morally a moral imperative to oppose genocide and to gain politically from it. Instead, they chose to be on the wrong side of history and pay a very dear political price for it domestically as well.
Last thought then, you alluded to this, the risk of a wider conflict in the Middle East.
I think what Trump does when he comes in is going to very quickly tell us which direction things are heading, but that is absolutely a very, very real and serious prospect. Both Iran and Israel are committed to escalation right now. Neither of them is willing to basically bow their head down and accept the other country's dominance, and that is on a trajectory where it's going to inevitably lead to a very, very major confrontation that could pull the United States in also directly. And the question is, does the U.S. have that appetite? Because if the U.S. is committed to not engaging directly, then they would absolutely have to put an end to what the way Israel is behaving in the region. This rampage that Netanyahu has gone on for an entire year has to come to an end. And if President Trump does not actually put an end to it, then it seems like it is actually inevitable. And we are looking for, at a scale of a regional conflagration that could not figuratively, but literally kill millions of people in the region. We are talking about a war that, with just the rocket arsenal that Iran has, the regional allies that they have, you're talking about the entire region being set ablaze, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Omar, we'll speak again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's get more on the political post-mortem with Matt Duss. He was the main foreign policy advisor to Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders. He's now executive vice president at the Center for International Policy. Matt Duss, thanks very much. I guess the first question is, where did the Democrats go wrong?
Well, I think, there's an anti-incumbent mood both here and around the world. This has been a year with a lot of elections in democratic countries, and incumbents have not done well. There's a general mood of just dissatisfaction and kind of questioning and a lot of hostility toward, the system or the establishment. And I think that's what we saw here. That's not to say that these concerns and this anger is not legitimate. I think it is. I think despite the fact that a lot of the economic indicators show that the American economy is in pretty good shape, a lot of people just aren't feeling that in their lives. The cost of living, the cost of basic goods, groceries, the cost of housing, these are rising. And clearly, American voters punish the Democrats for that.
For many years, Bernie Sanders was seen as the voice of reason for those who couldn't find, equity with either side of the Republicans or Democrats. I guess those guys are now saying we should have listened to Bernie Sanders.
Well, for the longest time, he was not seen as the voice of reason. But after, I think, 2016, yes, as you said, it became clear that someone who was himself a critic of the system and of the establishment was making a lot of the same arguments. I don't want to compare him to Trump too much, but both of them had an anti-establishment critique. I think Bernie's was obviously more unifying, I think more positive and constructive. And yes, I think in the wake of this week's defeat for Democrats, I think a lot of people are saying Bernie is onto something. So I think the question is, will the party leadership have the wisdom to really rethink, to understand what they got wrong, and really embrace that more kind of populist economic message that I think Bernie and his movement and others in the kind of populist left of the Democratic Party have been pushing?
There's also going to be the issue of winning back the lost voters. It surprised a lot of people. We had Arab American voters going one way, Black American voters, Latino American voters. There seemed to be a massive focus on these different groups and how it all shifted.
Right. No, I think that's right. We talk about Arab American voters, and we cannot not talk about Gaza. But I think that's not just an Arab American issue. I think there are a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, including Black Americans and others, for whom Gaza is bigger than just a foreign policy issue. The issue of Palestinian rights has become part of the kind of broader progressive social justice and racial justice agenda. But I think it's also in many ways a referendum on how America behaves in the world. You have a lot of Americans who have real questions about how America has operated American foreign policy over the past several decades. Obviously, the Iraq War was a huge turning point for a lot of people, but still to watch the United States for now over a year backing almost completely unconditionally this massacre, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the displacement of over almost 2 million, that is hard for a lot of people to take. And I think the idea that we were ever going to get people to kind of disassociate these things, I think was a fantasy. And again, this goes to whether the question now is whether the Democratic Party leadership is capable of really kind of assimilating these lessons.
Now, of course, Donald Trump will position it that he's won over all these voters. But to what degree was the Arab American pro-Trump vote really a backlash, simply an anti-Biden vote or anti-Biden administration vote?
I think it certainly was to some extent. I think that it's also worth noting, I think a lot in the Arab American community, which in this country is largely Christian rather than Muslim, although we do have a growing Muslim population. I mean, Trump brought a social conservative message. I mean, he spoke to social and religiously conservative audiences in the Arab American community and in the Latino community. Obviously, the evangelical community is very strongly pro-Trump, so I think that's a part of it as well.
So many nations around the world have had women leaders. To what degree was this a major setback for the idea of a woman U.S. president?
Yeah, I don't want to ever underestimate the element of sexism and misogyny that still certainly exists in our society. But I also don't want to overinterpret it that way. I think had Kamala Harris had a better message, had she done more work to kind of articulate a policy vision, and frankly had more time to run as the actual candidate, I think she was handicapped by both the kind of short amount of time she had to kind of get her campaign going, also the fact that she is the sitting vice president. So it was a little bit tough for her to distinguish herself from the president with whom she was still working. So I think all of those things hindered her as well.
Does she have a chance to re-enter the race at some point in the future?
I think it's probably unlikely. I think it's very rare, certainly in modern times, to see a candidate who ran and lost to come back. But I would not count it out completely, but I think it's very unlikely.
Matt, how did America become so divided?
It's been a long time coming, but I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think growing inequality. I think the fact that a lot of Americans are struggling, they see others doing much better. They feel that the system is unfair. They see privileges and wealth accruing to a very small elite. They've become cynical about the ability of government and of basic politics to deliver policy change that impacts them. And amid that frustration, and this is historically true, people will become more susceptible to demagogues who offer them a place to point that anger, people to blame, whether it's immigrants, whether it's minorities, whether it's foreign enemies. We can go back to times throughout history where we've seen this repeatedly happening. So that's why I think it's going to be very important for Democrats to offer a better vision of how we are actually the party that can help make your lives better in a way that does not simply displace that anger onto disfavored minorities.
To some degree, this level of polarization in America, it seems unprecedented, and it doesn't feel like it could be something that's healed that quickly. Is this something now going to be generational, this divide, or could this message of unity that the candidates kept putting out actually be achieved?
Right. Well, historically, we were pretty polarized. It led to the Civil War. I hope it will not lead to that again. I hope there will be a way for us to kind of reconstruct a shared concept of the American political project, because that's where we're at right now. We have, a really closely divided country and who have, two sides that have quite different visions of what it means to be an American, what America is for, who is really an American and who is not. And I think the work, so I would agree, it is probably generational, to do the work, to kind of reach across and talk to people with whom we disagree, people with whom, who have ideas that we might find offensive, and yet with whom we share this country. But that is the task ahead of us.
I think this election, certainly for an international audience, brought up the term swing states more than ever. And I think it surprises people that there can be such a geographical division within the US.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to colleagues around the world who are required to pay such close attention to our elections and our swing states and our bizarre electoral college, because it does impact them. Again, this is something I think it's important for Americans to keep in mind. This election, the outcome of our elections, impacts people around the world who have no say in those elections. And so yeah, I think there are several battleground states. Trump won most, if not all of them. But I think it's because there are, both sides have their own electoral map, their, so-called path to victory. And clearly Trump's path was the better one this time.
John Bolton, who was the former US ambassador to the UN and then became Donald Trump's national security advisor, and then fell out with him very badly, commented that his worry was a second Donald Trump presidency would allow Donald Trump, having realized what he could and couldn't do in the first one, to have much more power and much more focus on what he would do this time. What changes do you expect with the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't agree with John Bolton on a lot, but I do think he's right. I think Trump, in the 4 years of his first administration, Trump learned that you need to have people who are loyal to you. You need to have people who are willing to execute what you want. And I think he's done some work over these past years, clearly, to assemble a crew and a team that is more likely to do that. I mean, I think there are, in certain areas of the world, it depends what we're talking about. I think he will continue the work of the first administration. But what's interesting about this is, in a lot of areas, the Biden administration continued the work, or at least the direction of the Trump administration, starting with the focus on China, which has been the driving kind of imperative of American foreign policy, beginning with Trump. Biden has picked that up, but I think he stayed on the right side rhetorically, being careful not to, demonize Chinese or Asian Americans in a way that Trump certainly did. In the Middle East as well, too. I mean, with a few exceptions, Biden essentially carried forward what Trump was trying to do in the Middle East. And again, a lot of it driven by China, but the embrace of the Abraham Accords, seeing this as a kind of workable security and stability arrangement for the region, despite the cost and repression for the region's people. And the last thing I would say is, part of what 2016 showed us, and this is where I go back to what Bernie Sanders brought as well, was this sense that so many Americans, this system is not working for them. Our economic system, our trade system, our foreign policy. And so I think, what we did see from Biden, and this is one of the most important things, was the kind of move away from the old neoliberal kind of corporate-led global trade order. And I think there were very important steps taken to kind of try and define a new economic order that invests in American jobs, tries to rebuild American industry. But it's very easy to see how that could kind of evolve very quickly into kind of a new, trade blocks, trade war. And that is what we're going to likely see from Trump.
And one thing, the BRICS, or BRICS Plus nations, as they've come up to be now, are a growing strength, growing strong bloc. It sounds like Donald Trump is willing to poke the bear, so to speak, in creating greater division, especially with China and perhaps with India even. What is this going to do to America's position on the world stage, particularly with trade?
Yeah. I mean, first off, I think, yes, we are already farther into a multipolar era than I think many people in Washington would like to admit. The United States, obviously still enormously powerful, still has a set of partnerships and alliances that are really unmatched, yet our relative share of power is diminishing. Relative to China, relative to some of the countries, the BRICS countries that you mentioned. And I think Donald Trump has an inherent suspicion of multilateralism. We saw this goes back to his understanding of how you do business deals. He prefers kind of bilateral business deals. It's like me and you sit down and we work this out. So I think that is going to kind of undergird his attempt to kind of stoke divisions, not only in kind of alliances of adversaries, but also within alliances of allies as well.
Well, the two key factors, I guess, that could position America in the new era, apart from trade, is conflicts. And it seems that America might end up in a very difficult position when it comes to blocs taking sides, when it comes to Israel-Gaza and also Ukraine-Russia. Can Donald Trump stop conflicts in a day, as he promises?
Right. I mean, I think, Donald Trump, I think he's shown a willingness, he uses this kind of recklessness and kind of unpredictability. And again, it looks very different when you're doing it as a real estate mogul versus president of the United States. But unfortunately, he seems to take the same approach regardless. But we did see, in his first term, that even though I think his approach led us to the brink of conflict several times, like particularly with North Korea and then later with Iran, when he's faced with the possibility of really open conflict, he has stepped back. So I think there is something in his understanding that even though he's going to use the idea of conflict to try and get a better deal, he may act rationally in that moment. Now, I think we got lucky in both of those cases. We may not get lucky again, and I think that's what's very concerning, because once you go down this path, once violence really starts to erupt, it can spiral very quickly.
What do you expect his relationship under a second presidency to be with NATO?
Yeah. I mean, I would not expect him to withdraw from NATO at the outset, but I do think he's made his views on NATO clear, and that he feels that we are getting taken for a ride. I mean, we're getting ripped off is kind of Trump's kind of general argument, and that has a lot of appeal to Americans who have questions about, the role that America has played as a sort of global security guarantor. Are we getting a benefit in comparison to how much we are paying for other security? Now, I think there is a good argument that Americans have benefited enormously from this arrangement, but Trump, particularly with NATO, the way he talks about it, I mean, I still don't know if he understands how NATO works. He seems to think that European allies pay up to us instead of like paying into their own defense. But I think, and I expect, if they didn't start to get their act together the first time, I would hope the Europeans have gotten the message now that they do need to start to think a lot more seriously about looking to their own defense. Because as I said, I don't think Trump's going to pull out of NATO immediately, but I think he's definitely going to be making noise about this. And I'll be interested to see how our European allies respond.
On the issue of the climate and climate change, he seems to be a climate change denier to many and pushing, obviously, the fossil fuel agenda. I wonder how that will affect his relationship with countries like the Middle East, which, if anything, are trying to transition away from it.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, for Trump, it seems very basic. He just thinks that, renewable energy and believing in climate change is bad for business. That's what it comes down to him. For him. And I think, the way that Biden has approached it, when he's, the way he says, when I hear climate change, I think green jobs, I think more jobs. That's the better way to approach it. But yeah, I think as we saw in the first term when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, I think unfortunately we're going to see a rollback of a lot of these really important steps that were taken under the Biden administration to really starting investing in renewable energy and make a transition.
A final thought. One of my guests on my show said one of the issues that one of the issues with Donald Trump is that he thinks of himself as a president, as ruler of America, not as someone who serves American citizens, as an elected leader. Is that likely, that agenda, being the ruler of America, likely to really play in?
I think so. I mean, clearly, this is, you see this in the way he is very clearly kind of admiring of more powerful dictators, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi, leaders of other countries who have a lot more, authority to act as they want and have, populations under their control. He feels that, he felt that the first time. Now that he's been reelected, he will certainly feel it even more so. So I think we're going to see that reflected in the way he governs.
Especially with the House on his side now and changing the justice system.
That's right. This is going to be Trump unleashed.
Mantas, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this special edition of the show, coming to you from Washington, D.C. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's programme. The International Criminal Court issues arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant for alleged war crimes in Gaza. Well, the ICC has also issued a warrant for the Hamas military leader Mohammed Deif. Dozens of people are feared dead in northern Gaza following fresh Israeli strikes. Rescuers in the town of Beit Lahia fear many casualties are buried beneath the rubble. Russia is reported to have launched an intercontinental ballistic missile at Ukraine. If confirmed, this will be the first known use of this powerful weapon since the war began. And as Poland scrambles fighter jets close to the Ukrainian border, we ask, are we seeing the beginnings of an expansion of this conflict? Welcome to the programme. We're going to begin with the news that the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant. Well, the Hague-based court issued the warrant alleging war crimes in Gaza, saying it has reasonable grounds to believe that the leaders committed those crimes. Well, the court's announcement follows deadly Israeli strikes that hit crowded neighbourhoods. Dozens of people are feared dead in the latest attack near the Kamal Adwan hospital, which is in the town of Beit Lahia, and another in the Sheikh Radwan neighbourhood of Gaza City. Well, the latest strikes follow the US veto of a ceasefire at the UN Security Council last night. Well, for more on all of this, I'm joined now by Manuel Hassassian, who is the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Ambassador. We've had reaction from Israel to this news of the arrest warrant for the Israeli Prime Minister and his former Defence Minister. The Israeli government calls it absurd. The Israeli President says it's outrageous. What's your reaction?
Well, first of all, let me react to your initial report about the killing of so many people in Beit Lahia, especially during, early this morning and around Mustashfa Kamal Adwan. 88 martyrs have been, killed as a result of this ferocious attack, let alone at Sheikh Hyer Radwan, as you have mentioned. And many of the Gazans are still under the rubble. We don't know the actual end result of all these killings. And of course, can we call this genocide or not? This is a question for the international community that has been bolstering the Palestinian position that what Israel is doing is a genocide, and this genocide should go unpunished. And one of the immediate repercussions of such policies that have been inflicted upon the Palestinians in Gaza, especially, is the war crimes that have been committed by Benjamin Netanyahu and ex-Defense Minister Gallant. And I'm not surprised to see today the ICC coming out with this indictment of both as war criminals, let alone one goes to Mohammed Deif, who has been assassinated as a leader of Hamas by the Israelis. Of course, we expect an outraged reaction by the Israelis, and of course, it is so evident that they will use questions like anti-Semitism, that all these are pack of lies. It is absurd. Israel is defending itself. And, unfortunately, that the United States has been, yesterday just vetoed down a ceasefire in Gaza, and they are now attacking the ICC. Congress is threatening the ICC in not implementing, such a decision of indictment about Netanyahu and Gallant. And some European countries have been, not supporting this decision. Others are being silent about it, and others being, supportive of such a decision. What do we expect after 410 days of constant bombing and killing and starvation, with no fuel, no electricity, no medication, no food,
Sure, Ambassador, I'm going to raise some of those points. Let me just pick up on some of the points you've been making, because you raise a lot of interesting points. Let's just break this down a little bit. I mean, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that one of the few things that Hamas and Israel have ever agreed on is their condemnation of this decision by the ICC, because Hamas has also expressed outrage at the fact that Mohammed Deif has been named by the ICC. You say he's dead, but do we actually know for sure that he's dead?
Well, actually, all the reports, all the evidences that we have personally that have been collected, by the Palestinians, that yes, he is dead. And if he is dead, I mean, okay, if they issue a warrant in terms of Mohammed Deif, Hamas has, like Israel, basically would say that the people of Gaza, along with the Hamas resistance, are defending themselves. But actually, if you compare the rhetoric that comes out from Israel after 410 days of actual bombing, starvation, and killing, and to come and say that this is not a government of genocide, it is really absurd not to admit the fact that what has been going on for the last 400 days is total genocide. As far as Hamas is concerned, Hamas is also considered terrorist by the international community. And if there is an allegation against them concerning Mohammed Deif, he has been assassinated. So it becomes null and void as far as they are concerned. But actually, when we talk about the current regime in Israel with Netanyahu and ex-defense minister Gallant, let alone this Ben-Gvir-Smotrich government, should be held accountable. And that's why the ICC's decision has been received with outrage and with total, with a repugnant attitude from Israel and from the Prime Minister's office. It's something natural.
Okay, we're going to come to that. We're going to come to that in a second. But I just want to finish discussing Mohammed Deif with you, because he's accused by the ICC of torture, rape, taking hostages, murder. Do you condemn him?
Well, these are the allegations of the Israelis. We don't know whether
the ICC
Mohammed Deif
said
was behind it or not. And what evidence do I have personally to tell you about Mohammed Deif, except that he is a leader in Hamas? But to accuse him and make him accountable for what happened on October 7th, I don't have the evidence enough, to indict him or at least to condemn what he has done. So I cannot answer this question. I'm sorry.
But the ICC has named him specifically at the same time as issuing these warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. So don't we need to look at both sides of the coin here?
We are looking at both sides of the coin. And if Mohammed Deif has been inducted by the ICC, they should have proof. They should, give us the evidence to prove that he was directly involved in the massacres of October 7th.
Let's be clear. It's not very likely, is it, that Benjamin Netanyahu or Yoav Gallant are going to face a court at The Hague, is it?
I don't think so. First of all, the United States will do its utmost to repeal basically this indictment, and they will cover protection for both in Europe, maybe not in the Middle East, but at least in Europe, in Northern America, Canada, and what have you. And they will make sure that they will procrastinate the implementation of this decision to the point, if there is a ceasefire in the future, these will be dropped as being null and void.
Indeed. And, there is a precedent now, isn't there? Because the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, is also wanted by the ICC on a warrant of alleged war crimes in Ukraine. And yet he's been able to travel, well, not entirely unhindered, but he has been able to leave his country and travel in ICC member states. So this isn't likely to change very much, is it?
No, actually not. You see, Israel, has been outraged by such a decision. How come Israel, the democratic country that is defending itself, its leaders are being indicted by the International Criminal Court? the idea, the principle, but the actual implementation, they know that is not going to be binding, and that the United States will defend it, the UK will defend it in general. But the principle of being indicted made Israel go, being outraged by the fact that how on earth Israel could be condemned from war crimes.
The US President Joe Biden, you talked about how the United States is supportive of Israel. He's said that Israel should be allowed to defend itself. Obviously not sympathetic to what the ICC has announced, but you can't expect, can you, that the Trump administration is going to be any more sympathetic, is it?
No. The Trump administration would fight such a decision and would threaten the ICC, and it will threaten from withdrawing from the ICC and will put some sanctions on the ICC, will go the 9 yards, even further than Joe Biden, once he is in power. I mean, in January, when he will be ordained as the President of the United States. So I wouldn't be surprised if Trump will take it even further in supporting Israel and defending itself, and in trying basically to decriminalize Israel on its acts of war in Gaza, because he can always justify it as Israel defending itself and that Hamas is a terrorist, and the collective punishment and the genocide is a collateral damage is because of the terrorism of Hamas. That will be the justification of President Trump-elect, and that's why I don't anticipate any sympathy with the decision, but to fight this decision and to put pressures on the ICC by threatening the ICC, by using all kinds of extortionist methods to make this decision null and void.
And just lastly, in terms of reaction from the Palestinian side, the Palestinian ambassador to London called this announcement by the ICC a step towards accountability and justice in Palestine. Mustafa Barghouti saying this doesn't go far enough, and he says that genocide should be added to the list of crimes. Let me get your opinion. Is Benjamin Netanyahu a war criminal?
Well, actually, I mean, with the evidence that we have, with what we are seeing, with the effects on the ground, with the killing over 41,000 people, with at least 60,000 to 70,000 being injured, with starvation, no food, no, total destruction of Gaza, the northern part, and the continuation of his policies of extermination of the Palestinian people, what else should we call him?
So that's a yes?
Yes.
Thank you very much. That is all we have time for. Manuel Hassassian, the Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, thank you very much for your time today.
You're welcome, sir.
Well, the situation in Gaza continues to worsen, even as the prospects for a ceasefire deal remain ever more distant. While the war has claimed the lives of more than 44,000 Palestinians since 2023, as well as displacing more than 1 million others, it's also resulted in a widespread humanitarian crisis. Well, the International Criminal Court's decision to issue this warrant has been slammed by the office of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as anti-Semitic. And President Isaac Herzog called it a dark day for justice, as he pointed to the fact that Israeli hostages remain in captivity. Well, for more on this, we can speak now to Fleur Hassan-Nahum, who is the Israeli Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation, who joins us now from Jerusalem. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. First of all, can you just tell us what your thoughts were when you received the news of this decision by the International Criminal Court?
Well, we knew that it was very likely to come because in the summer they already announced that they're seeking to issue these arrest warrants. And again, extremely unprecedented, first of all, for the ICC to do that to a Western democracy that has its own legal system, Western liberal values. It's also unprecedented in the way that it was done, because normally they were supposed to come, Karim Khan was supposed to bring a mission to see for themselves, to come to Israel, to cross to Gaza, to actually gather evidence. And all of a sudden, that trip was mysteriously cancelled. And then without any warning, which again is against any type of precedent or protocol. Normally, you warn the authorities that you're going to be issuing arrest warrants, and this is done with full knowledge. And again, he tried to use the surprise element, again, completely unprecedented. And it's absolutely ridiculous that basically what he's saying is that Israel can be attacked as brutally as anything, but Israel doesn't have the right to defend itself, because if it does defend itself, then all of a sudden it's a war crime. Whatever precautions Israel takes, it doesn't matter. Defending yourself against a brutal attack, and I remind everyone, a war we didn't start, a war we didn't want, a war that could end in an hour if the hostages are returned, somehow that is Israel's fault. And so, yes, it does remind us of the dark days of the anti-Semitic Dreyfus trials that brought about the need for the modern state of Israel.
But doesn't all of this hinge not just on Israel's right to defend itself, but how Israel has defended itself?
I think Israel's defended itself in an exemplary manner. Which country in the world do you know eliminates its own moment of surprise in a war in order to give people warning to move them out of the way? We're dealing with an enemy. We're dealing with Hamas that is committing a double war crime. First of all, they started a war against us, killed, murdered, raped, and took hostages, innocent civilians, not military, innocent civilians. And then they use their people in order to defend themselves. Now, let me remind everyone, they have 800 kilometers of tunnels. If they really wanted to care for their people, why aren't they putting them in those tunnels for shelter?
Ironically, this is one of the very few instances of Israel and Hamas agreeing on something because, of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has slammed this decision by the International Criminal Court. Hamas has as well because one of their people has been named by the International Criminal Court for such a warrant. I mean, there's a bit of irony in there, isn't there?
Well, again, that's ridiculous. They're comparing a democratically elected leader with a terrorist. That's what they're doing. And let me just, the ICC is a court that literally doesn't have jurisdiction on the majority of the world. The countries, the larger countries of the world, are not part of the ICC, and for good reason. It's a politicized kangaroo court, which has not followed any protocol, which has a budget of $200 million a year, and yet, for 22 years of its existence, has only managed to indict 6 people. They're all brutal dictators. People like Khamenei, who are killing women, men, children in Iran, no indictments. People like Assad from Syria killed 500,000 of his own people, gassed his own people, nothing, no indictments. And so you have to agree that it seems very arbitrary the way that they're working and who they're choosing to indict.
A kangaroo court seems a rather damning assessment of the International Criminal Court, which...
Well, if it isn't, then why aren't the biggest countries in the world, the United States, part of this?
Well, plenty of other countries are. And as we've seen...
Very few of the countries that actually conduct any type of warfare. Ultimately, this is a defensive war that Israel is fighting. The way that we fought the war is actually in an urban warfare scenario. It's completely unprecedented. Every casualty, every civilian casualty is a tragedy. But ultimately, in terms of civilian casualties compared to terrorists, it's 1 to 2, that's unprecedented in itself. When you look at the way that the war was fought against ISIS in the Middle East by Western powers, it was 9 civilians to 1 terrorist. And here we've got 1 to 1. We've got 20,000 terrorists, and using even Hamas numbers, that is very low. And again, I repeat, it is every single civilian casualty is a tragedy. But ask yourself, who put these civilians in this situation to begin with? Why did Hamas attack Israel when they knew that Israel would come to get their civilians from their dungeons and would try and dismantle the threat?
Okay, let's go to the specifics of what was announced today by the ICC. This is something they said. This chamber considers that there are reasonable grounds to believe that both individuals intentionally and knowingly deprived the civilian population of Gaza of objects indispensable to their survival, which included water, food, medicine, and medical supplies, as well as fuel and electricity. Is none of that true?
None of it is true. Why is it that we've allowed it? Ultimately, under international law, the only obligation Israel has is to facilitate the entry. We've done more than that. We've not only facilitated the entry, we've also vaccinated millions of people. And recently, and it's interesting that nobody talks about it, we know that 90 tons of food and aid was stolen at gunpoint by Hamas. And so Israel does its job to facilitate aid. What happens inside when the useless United Nations organizations that are working there and the terrorists are stealing the aid and are selling it in the open market for ridiculous amounts of money, that's already not Israel's obligation. But Israel has facilitated 1 million tons of food and medicine. And again, if Israel wanted to cut the electricity off to Gaza, it could, and we haven't. So it's all a lie. But again, why didn't they just come here themselves the way they were supposed to in May to see if there was evidence? They're doing everything from their armchair and from a very, very pernicious motivation.
Let's just talk a bit about the Hamas leader who was named by the ICC, Ibrahim Al-Masri, who's also known as Mohammed Deif. He's accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. I was just about to ask you, what do we know about where he is?
It's him and Sinwar, and we've already taken care of that. So it's a little ridiculous, and that's why it's actually, thank God, we can do the work of the International Court, it seems.
13 months of warfare in Gaza, 44,000 people killed. Are you saying Hamas and Hamas alone is responsible for all of those deaths?
Absolutely. Only Hamas is responsible for the deaths of its own people, is responsible for not acting in order to protect his people. And when you have an imam from Gaza saying this, when you have the people of Gaza finally speaking out and saying Hamas have destroyed our lives, don't listen to me, let's listen to them.
But what about the civilians who really are entirely innocent in all of this? And we have to admit that civilians are entirely innocent.
The civilians are the innocent casualties of a war that should never have started, of a war that started in order to target only Israeli civilians, to scare Israel. And I pray that the people of Gaza, the innocent people of Gaza, get better leaders. Because for 20 years, not just now, for 20 years, they've lived under a repressive dictatorship. They had one election in 2005, and then Hamas took over. And so I pray that the people of Gaza, for them, they have better leadership. And in general, I pray that the Palestinian people have better leadership, because all they've had so far are either genocidal leaders that want to destroy the state of Israel and have never really accepted that we're not going anywhere, or corrupt leaders that have become billionaires on the back of their pain and suffering.
But can we be really surprised when you look at the conditions of people in Gaza for the last several decades? I mean, people who were born there haven't known one day that would look like a normal day for anyone else anywhere in the world, have they?
But whose fault is that? Israel left Gaza in 2005.
But this goes back.
So
this goes back decades.
When Israel unilaterally withdrew, it's supposed to be responsible. Don't they want autonomy? Don't they want a state? Gaza could have been the perfect pilot state. It could have been Dubai. It could have been. It's in the Mediterranean coast, and instead, with all the aid money, with all the investment, they decided to build 800 kilometers of tunnels instead of building the new Dubai. Why couldn't they have built the new Dubai and give their people a wonderful, wonderful life? No, instead they allied themselves with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They took all the aid money, billions and billions of dollars with zero accountability, and they built tunnels and started stockpiling weapons and preparing themselves for war. Does that sound fair to you?
Well, I mean, what doesn't sound fair is that millions of people are paying the price for the actions of a minority. And shouldn't Israel recognize that?
Well, unfortunately, Hamas was paying off half of the population in the Strip. And the people who really suffered are the people that weren't affiliated to Hamas. Whenever there was any type of dissent, there's no freedom of speech there, of course. Whenever there was any type of dissent, those people were brutally killed. Recently, we saw very disturbing footage of what they did to their own political dissenters in the Gaza Strip. So it is actually a mini Islamic Republic of Iran that they were running over there.
Just want to ask you, because we haven't got much time, there's another legal battle that Israel faces at the top UN court, the International Court of Justice. I just wonder if you think that's also a kangaroo court. And that is, of course, a case that South Africa has brought against Israel, accusing the country of genocide. What do you make of that?
Well, it's that the case is falling apart. South Africa asked for an extension to provide more evidence because they can't find any. And we all know that South Africa is basically using its status in order to be the mouthpiece of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Qatar. The cases are falling apart, and if they have any integrity, they'll see that for themselves.
So you don't think that either case will have any, do you think either case will have any consequence for Prime Minister Netanyahu in particular? Because if countries do comply, will he have difficulty? Will he have freedom of movement if he's with such a warrant in place?
Well, that's a good question. The question is, how is the world going to react? How are the countries that are actually not part of the ICC and that themselves could face recriminations like the one that we've seen against Israel? Will the United States now use their own power, their own soft power, their own legal power to punish the ICC in order for that not to happen to them? I certainly hope so. And I hope that these countries completely ignore these arrest warrants because they're completely unprecedented, completely biased. And this, if a Western country with liberal values, a democracy like Israel, can have this happen to them, then any country, any democratic country is basically under threat of not being able to defend themselves against an aggressive neighbor, which is exactly what's happened to us.
And just lastly, I mean, there are reported to be tens of thousands of people on the brink of starvation in northern Gaza. And I just want to ask you specifically about starvation, because it's spelt out as being a war crime if it's used as a method of warfare. What do you say about this?
Well, Israel is not deliberately starving anybody. We're allowing and facilitating food going in. Once the food goes in, if Hamas are stealing that food at gunpoint, which we know that they did last week, then that is certainly Hamas who's responsible. And it's certainly no policy of the Israeli government to use starvation as a method of war. That is a complete lie and fabrication.
OK, well, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Fleur Hassan Nahum, thank you indeed.
Thank you.
Now, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that Russia likely launched an armed intercontinental ballistic missile at the city of Dnipro today, while Zelensky accuses the Russian leader Vladimir Putin of using Ukraine as a weapons testing ground. Well, this follows earlier reports that said that the missile launched by Russia was ballistic, but not an ICBM. Well, Ukrainian air defenses shot down 6 Kh-101 cruise missiles during the attack. Well, the launch is the latest sign of mounting tensions in the war after Ukraine fired US and British-supplied missiles at targets in Russia. Well, for more, we can cross to Kyiv now and speak to Olena Sotnik, who is a former MP and advisor to the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Russia is reported to have launched these intercontinental ballistic missiles today at Ukraine. It's the first time, we gather, this type of powerful weapon has been used in the conflict. What more can you tell us about that and the level of damage that it caused?
First of all, I think that it is about geopolitical damage for those who really care about international agreements, international rules, because with this, Russia demonstrated that they can blur the lines of international law and treaties. It's not like, of course, tactic nuclear weapon, but still it is kind of the signal that they can use intercontinental weapon without using air support. So for thousands of kilometers. For us, it's not just a threat to Ukraine now. It's already threat and very clear threat, very clear signal to all our partners, and I think that reaction should be, very harsh, and even those who've been somehow flexible with Putin and thinking about getting agreement with him. They should be now very direct that this is the red line, and Russia is like playing with very dangerous kind of risks and possible reactions, and possible like ruining the balance of also nuclear deterrence is there. So we should be very cautious about that. And for sure, that's kind of more psychological threat. It is attempt, first of all, to put pressure on Ukraine, to threaten people, to threaten civil population, first of all, because what Russians doing for the last month, they're just hitting civilian areas. They're hitting residential houses without any limitations.
Sure, and I wanted to ask you about the significance of Dnipro. It's a city in the central eastern area of Ukraine, and it's been the target of quite frequent Russian attacks lately, and I'm just wondering why you think that is.
First of all, because that's one of the biggest cities not on the front lines, but near the front lines, with all the capacities which supporting, first of all, humanitarian support, medical centers are there, and they're helping to those who, for example, relocated from front lines. There are a lot of IDPs living in this city. There are a lot of, as I said, hospitals there which supporting people who've been wounded, both civilians and military people. And of course, it is, one of the main cities in terms of logistics, in terms of helping to east of Ukraine. And it's one of the also of the biggest economic centers. And when you are a country in the war and your budget is really stretched and GDP is very important to continue the fight, and Ukraine really has a huge deficit. Economic center like Dnipro also very important. That's why, of course, Russia is trying to break this line. They are trying to break the economic stability in order to somehow to stretch Ukrainian capacity to fight.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to ask you whether you think this attack using this type of weaponry by Russia is a sort of a direct response to the attacks on Russian territory using these more powerful US and British missiles that have been used in the last couple of days. Is that the way it looks to you?
For me, taking into account, there is no evidence for now, but just different military experts who are analyzing the trajectory of the missile, intercontinental missile hit, and in general the characteristics of this hit, that it was more kinesthetic than explosion threat. And it means that what is Putin trying to do? He's trying to showcase that he is more powerful than he is in reality. And for sure that now he has the only one argument nowadays, to threaten those who are vulnerable. I mean, civilians, ordinary people in the cities which are not maybe defended as strong as, for example, Kyiv or other cities in Ukraine. And he is attacking, for example, Kryvyi Rih or Sumy, cities near the forefront, and they're attacking civilian areas. What they're trying to do, they're trying just, to frighten us, to frighten people. But in reality, that's everything about demonstrating additionally that there is no military capacity to win, but there is very terroristic style of approach to terrorize civilians, to terrorize cities, and to showcase probably mighty, but as we can see, there is nothing there in terms of the military capacity.
Let's just examine this decision by the British and the Americans to greenlight the use of these weapons. I mean, obviously there's been a lot happening in the United States in the last few weeks, and it's reported, that in his final 2 months in office, President Biden really wants to try to get Ukraine into a strong position ahead of eventual negotiations. Is that how it looks to you?
Yeah, that's true that we are trying to, we are trying to persuade our partners to take the right decision, which should be taken like long time ago. And I think that's one of the main problems of kind of support of Ukraine. Because like the right decisions, they are taken sooner or later, but rather later than at the moment when we need it. And that's what we can see, for example, with the counteroffensive operation in summer, which could be much more successful if our partners would support us earlier. And we didn't lose this time when Russia built their, fortifications, etc., etc. Then we had this problem with the glade bombs, and of course we would we urged much earlier our partners that we need proper air defense in order, to somehow to oppose this kind of weapons, which is like really problematic both on the forefront but for to protect civilians. And we just received, air defense aircrafts. I mean, like a few months ago. So, and now we're talking about long-range weapon. How you can win the war if the logistics centers near the forefront? It's almost impossible. And then we've been talking about that for the last 2.5 years. And and just now we are receiving partial permission to use it. I think that's the main case, that probably like when we are hearing about red lines, but then our partners, they decide, okay, that's the moment when Russia already crossed all the red lines, and they're giving us some permissions or some support. But the question is time, and it's very important that this decision should be taken in time.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, I mean, do you think one of the red lines as far as Washington was concerned was the fact that Russia is now deploying North Korean troops to the region? Do you think that for Washington was a line that's crossed that meant perhaps Washington had to respond by saying, right, okay, Ukraine, you can now use this weaponry? Do you think that was a turning point?
I don't know if it was a turning point, but I can tell you that in general, for the international perception of the Russian war in Ukraine, we should already be cautious that it's becoming now not like regional war, but it's becoming international. And the main worry of United States, of course, was always China and Asia. And now when, it is a clear triangle of Iran and North Korea involved and Russia in the same, in the same level of raising the risks. I think that it's time to understand that there is no division between these different regional wars. It is everything in one package, and if we want to somehow deter this, and if we want to prevent huge escalation, the way how to deal with that's the way how to deal with the international conflicts, where already Asia threats of risk, Asia threat of conflict is already there, because we have fact of deployed North Korean military forces, and it's becoming really frustrating, and probably more decisive movement needed.
I mean, we're 33 months into this war now. This week we passed the 1,000-day mark of conflict, and it really feels, looking at it from the outside, that things are coming to some sort of a conclusion, that things are escalating to the point that they've got to come to some sort of an end. Just so much back in the news cycle in the last couple of weeks. I mean, is that how things feel where you sit in Kyiv?
The war continues and people dies, and we continue to fight for each centimeter of our territory. I just want to remind you that like thousands of Ukrainians on the occupied territories now, and they under the threat of death, tortures, etc., etc. So it is very hard to say that we are coming to conclusion. What kind of conclusion? That's the main question. Like, do we want to just cross the line between these people and Ukrainian territories which controlled by Ukraine? I think that's probably against all the principles of international law and against everything what we've been fighting for. So I wouldn't say like this. It's very difficult moment when, you know, a lot of unclarity, a lot of frustration because of the different political cycles in different countries. Basically, I'm talking about United States and some European countries. Like we can see that, you know, it's like more like internal policy is becoming more important than international or external threat. And I think that it should be frustrating for everyone who is taking care about the future stability of the continent, but also about the future stability of the world in general.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what I was getting at as well is the fact that, you know, in 2 months from now, there'll be a new president in the United States. And you allude to that as well. And of course, Donald Trump saying he's going to end this war. And I'm just wondering how people in Ukraine think he's going to do that and at what price?
That's a very good question. Of course, we can have a lot of scenarios, but I can tell you what will work. The only one decision that Ukraine is a main member of NATO, because any other decisions and, you know, to stop the, to have the ceasefire, for example, doesn't mean to stop the war. And to stop the war, you need to have, you know, effective measures and effective methods of deterrence, and you need security guarantees. And NATO is the only one security guarantee which can somehow, you know, gave us perspective of safety and not repetition of the invasion in the future. And then the question is if Biden is ready to, you know, to move on and to talk about Ukrainian membership in NATO. That's the main question.
But in terms of the territorial price, I mean, at the moment, 1/5 of Ukrainian territory is under Russian control. I mean, do you imagine a day, or do you think it's realistic that Russia is going to relinquish control of areas of the country that it's captured?
Yeah, but that's all depends on, you know, on the general strategy of our partners and Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for their territories. It is about our sovereignty. It is about international law. Like, there is nothing like to discuss. The question is, of course, we are dependent from our partners, and what would be the general solution? What would be, you know, the understanding of the future of this world? Because, okay, if like people, or for example, United States or Trump is ready to put pressure on Ukraine to give up on the territories, he should expect that the same could happen in other areas, in other regions. And then the question was the possible, you know, conflict in Taiwan. Then how he will deal with that. So I can't tell you because it's for sure not Ukrainian interest. And Ukrainian interest to restore the sovereignty, to restore the control over our territory, and first of all, to you know, to provide guarantee for Ukrainian people who are staying on this occupied territories without law, without any guarantees of security.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Elena Sotnik, thank you very much indeed for your time today.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, for more analysis, we can cross now to London and speak to General David Richards, former UK Chief of the Defence Staff. Lord Richards, thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. We're getting these reports that suggest that Ukraine has now fired UK-supplied long-range Storm Shadow cruise missiles at Russia for the very first time. Moscow saying it's shot some of these missiles down. Does all of this sound credible to you? And if so, how significant is this?
I think it's certainly credible. Our Prime Minister seemed to be keen to do this a number of weeks ago, but had to wait for President Biden to give authority to use American ATACMS, because there's a linkage to the guidance systems that the British use for their Storm Shadow. So I think it's the case. I mean, we'll, as ever, and I learned this as a soldier of many years, you know, you never believe first reports, but I think it probably is credible and has now happened. The significance, we would say that it might have tactical significance. That's, if you like, local importance. But in terms of the eventual outcome of the war, i.e. the strategic level, I doubt it'll have much value.
So you don't see this as being the major escalation that some in Moscow are calling it?
I can see why the Russians would view it as an escalation, because it does bring Western weapons, allows Western weapons to be fired into and onto Russian territory. So that is an escalation of kinds, but and it will annoy them. There's no doubt about it. They thought they weren't going to have that extra headache because they've already moved a lot of their logistic bases and air bases further east to get out of this possible quandary. But why I say I don't think it's of huge significance is that at the end of the day, it's not going to cause Russia to lose the war. It might put Ukraine into a better bargaining position for when, as even now President Zelensky seems to concede, President-elect Trump comes to power and decides to impose in some way a ceasefire.
Do you think Washington and London were right to give these weapons to Ukraine and the green light to now use them on Russian territory?
Well, I think one could argue that it's too little and too late. And it sounds now, it can appear to some people, it's a little bit sort of a panicky reaction on the back of President Trump winning the election. If this had happened 2 years ago, then I think it could have had much greater significance. The problem that Ukraine has faced from the start is that Western nations, particularly the US, Britain, France, have encouraged President Zelensky and the Ukrainians to fight a war without giving them the means to actually win it. I think that is strategically questionable, but also morally questionable, because people are dying on a daily basis in the hope of achieving a victory that in practice will be very difficult to achieve. So I think I'm with President Trump insofar as now is the time to draw a line under this one way or another. Clearly, Ukraine wants to be in as good a position as she can be at the point that line is drawn. But to go on fighting, and some people talk about a frozen war, means there'll be a very unstable and increasingly unstable situation in Eastern Europe. Mistakes will happen. People do silly things. And suddenly, you know, the thing has got a lot worse. So I think now is the time, unless NATO nations are prepared to enter the war themselves, and I don't think that's going to happen for good reason, then now is the time to start talking about a ceasefire.
Earlier this week, we spoke to a spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, Sergei Markov, who said that people in the UK could be spending Christmas in a bomb shelter. He seemed to suggest that a NATO-Russian confrontation was quite likely by making that comment.
Well, I think, first of all, the only person that really matters is President Putin. Why would he do that when Mr. Trump is about to take over the reins of power? He will not want added problems in terms of resolving this problem. the war in Ukraine. So I doubt personally that is likely to happen. And anyway, that would be, and what he implies in it, a major escalation, which would draw NATO into the war directly, as opposed to the indirect manner in which he is interpreting the use of these Western weapons.
Yeah, the comments were made in the context of the loosening of the nuclear doctrine. I just want to pick up on something you said earlier on this year. You were amongst a group of former defence and security chiefs in the UK who said the British Army must, quote, prepare genuinely for war. You made those comments 8 months ago, and I'm just wondering whether you think that since then the UK is looking more prepared and whether you think the threat is looking greater.
Well, look, I'm the biggest peacenik of all time, like a lot of, I think, reasonably good generals, because we've seen a bit of war. The whole point of preparing for war is not to fight it, God forbid, but to be strong enough to make one's potential adversary not want to take us on. And I think what we've got to remember in the case of Russia and Ukraine is that strategically, Russia has lost. NATO today is stronger, more united than NATO was 3 years ago. They have got hold of the 4 oblasts, or the bulk of the 4 oblasts in the east of Ukraine, and they've retained Crimea. But I don't think one could argue that strategically they've won. But we don't want to take a risk. And therefore, NATO nations now have a period in which they have got to make sure that should Russia up the ante again in some way, I've always personally felt it unlikely, but we shouldn't take the risk by making sure our own armed forces are more than up to any challenge that could be offered by Russia. But look, I'm like a lot of good guys. I said I want to avoid a war. I'm not encouraging one. I think it's time to draw a line under this broadly in the way that I understand President Trump is intending. And that seems to me a very sensible thing to do.
All right, well, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time, Lord Richard. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Now, Poland says it has scrambled fighter jets and mobilized its forces in response to a Russian missile and drone attack on Ukraine. This as Russia claims that a new US ballistic missile defense base in northern Poland is going to lead to an increase in the overall level of nuclear danger. Well, Poland's foreign ministry spokesperson says that the base serves the purpose of defense and not to attack. Well, for more, we can speak now to Daniel Fried, who is a former Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs and a former US ambassador to Poland. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Poland, of course, a country you know well. It's a member of NATO as well. We're being told that Warsaw is on the highest state of readiness and they're scrambling these fighter jets near their border with Ukraine. Do you think we're seeing here the beginnings of an expansion of this conflict?
I don't think we are seeing an expansion to the degree that Poland would be drawn into the conflict. The Poles take security seriously. Their history teaches them that they must, and they have a serious military. They're no longer a small, poor country on the margins of Europe. They're a serious player. They take their security seriously. They scramble their jets because they don't want to see Russian missiles or drones flying into Poland. That said, they are unlikely to try to enter the war, and they will almost certainly not do so on their own. So I think that the Poles scrambling their planes is a prudent and serious move, but not any kind of escalation. I think that it may be in Putin's interest to create fears of escalation in Europe and the United States, so he can argue that peace on his terms is needed. That's what I think is going on here. But I think the Poles are absolutely right to take precautions, but these are serious people. They're not going to make any foolish moves.
It's easy to understand, though, why they feel so vulnerable, being so much closer to the conflict than pretty much every other country in Europe.
Well, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Romanians take this war seriously, and they are absolutely right to. The Poles the Baltic countries have been warning the Germans, NATO, and the US for many years that we needed to take the possibility of Russian aggression seriously. They were right. They were right all along. And those who thought that they had exaggerated the Russian threat or were Russophobes or emotional were just foolish. The Poles were right. And they are in a position now to be part of the NATO and transatlantic core decision makers about what we do next with Ukraine and for Ukraine.
And of course, they've got this new base, this air defense base that's opened in northern Poland just this week. It's not new news. It was an expected and long in the making, long in the construction base, but presumably extremely reassuring for Poland to have that at this particular moment.
The Poles have welcomed U.S. military presence in Poland, and there is a national consensus in Poland about increasing their military expenditures. Before Russia started its war of conquest against Ukraine, the U.S. had almost no military presence in Poland at all. Now we have, as I said, over 10,000 troops in Poland. And they are there because Russia has started a war of aggression, and we take our responsibilities seriously as Poland's NATO ally and a country that wants to see Russian aggression stopped.
Just speaking about NATO, I mean, obviously a degree of nervousness amongst NATO members about what the new administration in Washington has got planned. Just before we talk about that, let's talk about what you think the Biden administration is trying to achieve in its final 2 months, because a lot has been announced during the course of the last couple of days. What do you think President Biden is trying to achieve, specifically with regards to Ukraine, as he prepares to leave the White House?
There's no mystery. I think the Biden people are trying to send as many weapons as they can to Ukraine, including lift restrictions that should have never been imposed on Ukraine's use of those weapons. I also expect the Biden administration will launch additional economic measures to put pressure on Russia. I'd be surprised if they didn't. They're trying to put, as they have said, Ukraine in the best possible position as the Trump administration takes office. There's no mystery here. I wish the Biden people had done more and faster, but I welcome what they've done.
Indeed, there's an article that you wrote just a few days ago in Just Security, and you say the Biden administration did a lot to support Ukraine's defense, rallying European and other nations to do the same. I don't share the cynical view that the Biden administration was stingy. But what you do seem to be saying is that perhaps by sending important weaponry or giving the green light for important weaponry at this late stage, it was late in the day.
I think that's right. I think the Biden administration was agonizingly and unnecessarily slow each time it had to make a decision about sending sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, F-16s or tanks or HIMARS tactical rockets or ATACMS or the permission to use ATACMS. I think the Biden administration overthought the problem. They did a lot. I want to give them credit, but I think they were slow. I think part of the slowness was that they didn't really think at first that Ukraine had a chance to defend itself. The Biden administration was spot on accurate, just nailed it when it came to Russia's intention to invade. But they were wrong about the outcome of that invasion. They thought the Ukrainians would lose quickly, that they would fight bravely and die fast. That was wrong. The Ukrainians stopped the Russian offensive. The Russians never got near Kyiv. The Ukrainians pushed back the Russians. I think we should have moved with more weapons faster in the early days. But to be fair to the Biden administration, we weren't prepared for such an eventuality. We never thought that Ukraine had a chance in a full-scale war against Russia, and we came around only by slow steps to realizing that the Ukrainians had a chance.
And of course, the authorization of the use and the delivery of ATACMS by the United States came with a certain amount of fanfare and an announcement that this had been done. And we've spoken to analysts on this channel who've said that it would be better not to make announcements and just to hand over the weaponry without making an announcement. What do you think is the purpose of announcing such a thing before you do it?
Well, you know, I have great sympathy for those who said we should have let the ATACMS announce themselves. What happened was a leak, and I don't know whether it was an authorized leak or not. The story appeared in the press that the Biden administration had finally given the Ukrainians permission to use ATACMS inside Russia. And then there was a period where the Biden administration didn't confirm it, and finally the Ukrainians did use it. I think as a tactical matter, it would be better to say less about provision of weapons, say nothing about escalatory dangers, but simply allow the weapons to announce themselves. That said, here we are, and I think the Biden administration is going out the door, doing the best it can, and eyes are shifting to the Trump administration to see what they will do.
Indeed, and the Russians don't tend to announce things either, such as the introduction of North Korean troops onto the battlefield. That was obviously discovered.
No kidding.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that's been a game changer?
Militarily, I don't think so. I don't think that the North Koreans have had a decisive impact on the battlefield, at least not yet. The Russians' use of North Korean soldiers demonstrates that Putin is unwilling to mobilize Russian young men in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other major Russian cities to fight his war of aggression in Ukraine. That tells you something about his real calculation of what Russians feel about the war. If they were genuinely behind it, he would mobilize. But they're not, so he won't. He brings in North Korean troops. That is ultimately a sign of weakness. It's not clear to me how the Korean troops will fight. No, the Ukrainians might find ways to entice them to come over. We shall see.
Let's look forwards to what happens in the next couple of months. Do you think Donald Trump has got a peace plan?
Well, there's no mystery that the Trump team has sketched out elements of their diplomatic approach to end this phase of the conflict. No mystery at all. J.D. Vance outlined it. It's something like a ceasefire in place, some either temporary or longer-term prohibition on Ukraine entering NATO, which I think is a foolish commitment to make. Doesn't matter what I think. And third, and this is important, J.D. Vance said that the line of contact, the new agreed line should be fortified to prevent the Russians from resuming their offensive. That's important because if the Trump plan is to be workable, Ukraine has to be supplied with weapons. And I think European troops and other troops should be sent to Ukraine to help monitor and enforce a ceasefire. And those troops would require some American backing. Now, that latter point is not part of the Trump peace plan, but a couple of European foreign ministers have already raised this as a possibility. So it's not difficult to imagine what the Trump plan could look like. What the Russian reaction is, I can't say. The initial Russian reaction to the Trump administration feelers about this sort of thing was hostile. They essentially demanded in public, not the Russian government, but Russian Kremlin-aligned spokesman, demanded basically Ukraine's surrender. I don't know that Donald Trump would accept that kind of an arrogant answer from the Kremlin. If he comes forward with a plan, he might well say that if the Russians reject it, he will double down on support for Ukraine. This is possible. Not saying it's going to happen, but there are possibilities open for a tougher Trump position than the Russians might hope for.
And of course, Ukraine's got plenty of allies in Europe, but I'm just wondering whether you think they are...
It sure does.
Do you think they're going to exert influence on the incoming Trump administration to perhaps make him reconsider? He hasn't sounded sympathetic to Ukraine over the years, I think it's fair to say. And do you think they might help him to reconsider?
They might. We started out discussing Poland. Poland has the standing, the Polish government and the Polish president have the standing with Trump world to make these points. The Polish president, Andrzej Duda, had a good relationship with Trump when he was president, and I think that President Duda is planning to visit Mar-a-Lago. The Polish government is politically very different from the president, but the Polish foreign minister is very smart and knows Americans really well. The Polish prime minister has reached out to Europeans, and the Polish foreign minister just hosted the European Big Five countries, Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, in Warsaw to discuss a number of critical topics, chief among them Ukraine. So the Poles are rallying European support. The Germans have been very supportive of Ukraine, but their government, off divided, has now fallen. They're in an election cycle. It'll be hard for them to show leadership. Macron has been excellent in support of Ukraine, though France hasn't done as much as it could. But Macron's political position is also not strong. The British have been very good on Ukraine. And so is Italy. So you can see that most of the Europeans are either favorably disposed and politically committed, or at least favorably disposed toward Ukraine. So there's something to work with. The Trump people will insist that Europe does more for Ukraine. And I think that they're right. The Europeans do need to stand up more, and they do need to increase their defense spending. The Poles have already done so. So I think that there is some trade space for the Europeans to work with the incoming Trump administration to support Ukraine. And I think this process is already in motion.
Just lastly, I mean, we were talking about how NATO allies are anticipating, and they have been anticipating for some time, the reality, now immediate reality, of Donald Trump's return. Do you think their nervousness is in any way justified?
Sure, it's justified. There are people in Trump world who have expressed contempt for NATO, contempt for Europe. Trump occasionally talks about hitting the Europeans economically. That may not be where they land, but that is certainly what they've said from time to time. We'll see how this works out. Marco Rubio, the future nominee for Secretary of State, is pretty solid, has a good reputation in Europe. I think that the new National Security Advisor, Congressman Walz, is also a serious person, but we'll see where the Trump administration's lands.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us.
Pleasure.
Daniel Fried, it's been great speaking to you.
Thanks for the opportunity. Bye.
Well, that is all we have time for today's edition of Global News Today. Thanks for watching. Do join us again tomorrow. Meanwhile, bye-bye.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So, Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No. The Democratic Party lost its way.
They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, you know, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, well, a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019, she failed. 2020, she failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy. Yeah,
the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid it $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't mess around.
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans AAA players that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work because my family, you know, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he sacked or he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds, because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, you know, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I point that out is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you riot against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the Supreme Leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there. Squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, Reciprocal Tariff Act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. Now we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the Supreme Leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal. You can't use their courts. A good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the U.S., the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it via a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great. It depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because remember they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the Supreme Leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So again, squeezing the Supreme Leader's head there is good. And it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the Supreme Leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just somebody has to stop this.
Exactly.
And
on a human level, but as well as
I mean,
obviously markets. So
the world
affects
is
the bread and
uncomfortable.
butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector, you're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. It's in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support... The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no
I'll pay a pretty penny for an O'Leary band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So they don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
like on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, you know, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And you know, my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, you know, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kiev to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deep fake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle East.